Good morning, everyone. In commemoration of January as Human Trafficking Awareness Month, we welcome you to this ONA webinar on human trafficking and new Americans with disabilities awareness and prevention. Before we begin, we have a few housekeeping items to go over. Next slide, please. Thank you. My name is Jenny Munoz. I'm a policy associate at the New York State Office for New Americans. For this webinar, I will be offering technical support to you all. And you can connect with me in the chat function if you experience any technical difficulties throughout the webinar. Regarding accessibility, we will have American Sign Language interpreters with us today. Bear with us. We're talking with our vendor to facilitate that process. Once they join, we will communicate with you that they have joined. We also have live captions available. The link is in the chat function if you would like to view the live captions. Also, please make sure that you are muted and that your camera is turned off so that our connection is not slowed down. After the webinar, we will share the recording, the slides, a handout, and the transcript with everyone who has registered. You are welcome to share this material with your colleagues, and we will also reserve the conclusion of the webinar for questions and discussion. If you need your camera on to communicate at the conclusion of the webinar, we could welcome you to turn your camera on. We will share several polls with you today that you can engage with. To access the poll feature, you can click the three dots for more options and select polling. Or you can open the panel above participants to access the poll feature. At the end of the presentation, you'll be sharing a satisfaction survey through a WebEx poll. Please make sure that you complete the satisfaction survey. We will also be emailing the satisfaction survey in case you are not able to complete it during the webinar. We also strongly encourage you, if you haven't already done it, to please introduce yourself in the chat function with your name, your title, the organization you belong to, and indicate if you are a grantee of the New York State Office for New Americans. Now, without further ado, let me pass it over to Laura Gonzalez-Murphy, Director of Immigration Policy and Research and Language Access Coordinator at the New York State Department of State.
Thank you, Jenny. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm also going to go off the video just because to ensure that I stay with you. For those of you joining us from outside the ONA network, I will take a moment to introduce the New York State Office for New Americans. ONA, which was established in late 2012, is the nation's first statutorily created immigrant service office of its kind in the nation, charged with the provision of an array of integration services, including legal support to all immigrants, irrespective of status, and we do so through a statewide network of community-based organizations. Through the Department of State's participation in Governor Cuomo's Interagency Task Force on Human Trafficking, ONA has learned about the particularly distressing issue of human trafficking and new Americans with disabilities in our state. We have also heard that some emergency room doctors were learning that in general, immigrants were fearful of accessing public benefits and services due to immigration policies such as the Department of Homeland Security's public charge rule, which has caused many immigrants to fear accessing even health insurance. From these medical professionals, we also heard that some immigrants, as a result of this fear, felt that they had no other options than to rely on any employment to survive, and were risking being trafficked for labor. With this information, ONA's Ramirez June initiative has incorporated efforts to raise awareness about the risks and barriers new Americans with developmental disabilities face and contribute to the prevention of human trafficking for this group of population, new Americans with disabilities. So now I will introduce Cynthia Stewart, the ONA Developmental Disabilities Navigator leading the Ramirez June initiative. The Ramirez June initiative is also a first of its kind in the nation to build capacity at the state level to support new Americans with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Cynthia joined ONA a little over a year ago, and we're really grateful for that. She has a Master's of Science in Mental Health Counseling from the State University of New York at Newport, and has provided therapy for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities as a mental health counseling intern. And as a direct support professional, she has assisted individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities to achieve their goals. Cynthia, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Good morning, everyone. We are so grateful that you have joined us today from across New York State and across the United States. We're grateful that you've joined us to discuss this important issue, and we hope to continue to connect with you after this webinar today. Just a reminder so that our connection stays strong, if you are not a presenter or an interpreter, please turn your camera off and make sure that you're muted. Thank you. The Ramirez June Initiative at the Office for New Americans is a first of its kind initiative in the nation to build capacity at the state level to support new Americans with intellectual and developmental disabilities. As Laura described, ONA has a network across New York State that supports new Americans. And the Ramirez June Initiative builds the capacity of the Office for New Americans Network to assist new Americans with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families in connecting with vital resources, information, and services in New York State. Through the Ramirez June Initiative, we also hope to engage with the wider disability communities to collaborate in improving accessibility and inclusivity overall. This initiative is a 3-year grant project of the New York State Developmental Disabilities Planning Council, and the initiative is named after and in honor of 2 new American families who live in New York State, the Ramirez family and the family of June Bloom. And the term New Americans, as you may know, refers to all newcomers who were born outside of the U.S. and who now live inside the U.S. So New Americans refers to immigrants, refugees, asylees, and undocumented individuals. And during this presentation today, when referring to intellectual and developmental disabilities, we will use the acronym IDD. Before we move forward with our discussion of human trafficking, I want to share a content warning. We will be discussing distressing topics today, including abuse. Because of this, we share this warning, and we also share the New York State Emotional Support Hotline, 1-844-863-9314. And this number will be in the materials that are sent to you before and after the presentation, and this number can come in handy, especially during the pandemic. Today, we will discuss human trafficking and explain what it is and what it is not. We hope to share helpful information that can inform your practice. And we're speaking about human trafficking today with a particular focus on new Americans with disabilities. But the information we share today will also be helpful for supporting other communities as well. We are joined today by representatives from the New York Governor's Interagency Task Force on Human Trafficking, who will later share with us a little about the work of the task force and how service providers can make referrals for trafficking victims in New York State. We will share case examples of human trafficking of new Americans and individuals with disabilities, as well as a case of domestic violence involving an individual with IDD. Together, we will practice making referrals for potential human trafficking situations, and we will have time for discussion and questions. And finally, at the end, we will share a 5-minute meditation. We welcome you to join us in to help ground us all so we can go on with our day and take this helpful information with us. Does human trafficking happen in the U.S.? Unfortunately, yes. This image shows human trafficking cases from 2019 alone, and areas that are red in the map have higher numbers. And keep in mind that some of these trafficking cases have occurred in multiple locations. You can view this information on the Polaris Project website. Polaris operates the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and they have a lot of great resources about human trafficking. As a mental health counseling intern, I engaged with youth in foster care who were survivors of human trafficking, and that was the first time I really became aware that human trafficking does happen across New York State. This visual shows reported human trafficking situations that occurred in New York State in 2019 alone, which according to the Polaris Project, they identified 805 victims of human trafficking, 173 traffickers, and there were 83 businesses involved in human trafficking in New York State in 2019. So what is human trafficking? There are harmful conspiracy theories circulating online that spread misinformation about human trafficking. So it's important that we understand what human trafficking actually is. Human trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to make someone work against their will. Someone is being trafficked when a trafficker has used force, fraud, or coercion to maintain control over that individual and cause them to believe they have no other choice but to continue working. Trafficking does not need to involve movement. Movement can be involved, but individuals have been trafficked in their own homes and communities. And human trafficking occurs in all types of communities, urban, rural, and suburban. The anti-human trafficking field is relatively new. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or the TVPA of 2000, is the first comprehensive federal law that addresses human trafficking and gives prosecutors tools to hold traffickers accountable. TVPA makes human trafficking a federal crime with severe penalties. And since the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed, federal prosecutors and civil litigators have used this law to bring cases against traffickers, including cases of human trafficking of individuals with disabilities. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act also established the T-visa, which is for new Americans who are survivors of human trafficking. And in New York State, we also have the New York State Human Trafficking Law of 2007. At this time, I'm going to open a poll that you can engage with, and we will discuss the poll results in a few moments. A lot of time when we think about human trafficking, we think of sex trafficking. There is more awareness for sex trafficking, but human trafficking does not always involve sex. Labor trafficking, in fact, is believed to be more prevalent than sex trafficking. But labor trafficking is also reported less than sex trafficking, according to the Polaris Project. Labor trafficking is defined as the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. And peonage and debt bondage refer to when a trafficker has a trafficking victim work to pay off their debt. For instance, if someone tells you, my boss says I owe money and need to work to pay them off, this is a potential indicator of labor trafficking. Labor trafficking and trafficking in general do not only occur in illegal or underground industries. Human trafficking occurs in farms, hotels, nail salons and spas, restaurants, construction, domestic work, landscaping, and factories. and individuals with disabilities have been trafficked in all sectors. Sex trafficking is when someone providing commercial sex is doing so against their will as a result of force, fraud, or coercion. Not all sex work is sex trafficking. However, any commercial sex involving a minor under the age of 18 is sex trafficking regardless of the use of force, fraud, or coercion. A minor cannot consent to engage in sex work. Indicators of sex trafficking could be if someone tells you that they were reluctant to engage in sex work, but that someone pressured them into it, or they want to stop engaging in sex work, but they are afraid to stop. Adults and children with disabilities have been trafficked for sex. So we said that human trafficking involves force, fraud, or coercion. Let's unpack what these terms mean. Force could involve physical confinement or physical abuse or sexual abuse. That part is pretty straightforward. Fraud involves misrepresentation of what the work entails. For instance, traffickers lie about what someone would be paid when they actually would be paid very little or nothing at all. Traffickers using fraud to recruit new Americans might lure victims with promises of obtaining a green card, having their debts paid off, or having a pathway to citizenship. For instance, if someone says, I kept working because my boss promised me he'd help me with the green card or make me a partner in the business, this could be an indicator of labor trafficking. Coercion means persuasion with force or threats. This could be threats of serious harm or physical restraint against any person, or even threats against their family. Coercion also involves any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause a person to believe that if they don't do what their trafficker wants, it will result in serious harm or physical restraint to them or their family. And coercion can also involve the abuse or threatened abuse of the legal process. Someone says, my boss says they'll call ICE on me, or my boss says, I'll say you stole from me and I'll call the cops and have you arrested. These are indicators of labor trafficking. And these are very real threats for new Americans who may feel that they do not have protection or support of these systems. For trafficking victims with intellectual or developmental disabilities, traffickers have threatened that the individual would be institutionalized if they did not work. This year, we celebrated the 30th birthday of the Americans with Disabilities Act. But we have a long way to go to make our society and environments accessible and inclusive for all. Individuals with disabilities face barriers when society and different environments are not accessible and inclusive. Traffickers and abusers often prey on individuals who face inequities. And in their abuse, they enforce these inequities. According to the U.S. Department of State, individuals with disabilities are one of the most at-risk groups of being trafficked. And then in terms of trafficking in new American communities, recent migration is a major risk for both sex and labor trafficking. So new Americans with disabilities are at an increased risk for human trafficking. Inequities increase vulnerabilities to abuse such as trafficking. For instance, people of color and individuals who identify as LGBTQ+ are also among the most at risk for trafficking, according to the Polaris Project. While some groups are at an increased risk, it is also true that anyone can be trafficked. Individuals of all statuses and backgrounds have been trafficked. For instance, you may have followed the recent case of trafficking in the capital region of New York State with the group called NXIVM. The leader of this group was found guilty of sex trafficking, and this group targeted affluent individuals. For instance, one of the survivors of the group India Oxenberg, who's spoken out about her experiences. She's the granddaughter of the princess of the former country of Yugoslavia, and she still has experienced this. Now let's take a moment to reflect on our poll. So true or false, human trafficking is the same as smuggling of migrants. I see that most of you indicated that this is false, and that is the correct answer because trafficking is different than smuggling of migrants. A main difference between trafficking and smuggling is consent. Smuggling is the unlawful transportation of objects, substances, information, or people. A relationship between migrants and a smuggler is time limited, and it's typically a consensual relationship when it's between adults. Human traffickers, however, transport their victims through the use of force, fraud, or coercion across international borders, states, and counties, or within the victim's home and community. And force, fraud, or coercion means that a situation is not consensual. Human trafficking is a crime against an individual, and it is a federal crime as well as a state crime in New York State. While smuggling, on the other hand, is a crime against the U.S. border and is a federal crime. Now, Laura Gonzalez-Murphy, who represents the New York Secretary of State at the Interagency Task Force on Human Trafficking, will introduce the representatives of the task force who have joined us today.
Thank you, Cynthia. As I mentioned earlier, the Department of State is a member of Governor Cuomo's Interagency Task Force on Human Trafficking, which was established in 2017. And in this role, this presentation is provided in collaboration with the task force. Representatives from the two state agencies that co-chair and also staff the task force will now share with us more about its work and referral process. So I have the pleasure today of introducing to you Nora Croning, who is Assistant Director of the Bureau of Refugee Services at the Office for Temporary Disabilities, and Carl J. Bolton, who we call CJ, Director of Human Trafficking Prevention at the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services. Nora and CJ lead the Governor's Interagency Task Force on Human Trafficking, and we welcome them to share with us about the task force and the New York State referral form for victims of human trafficking. Welcome, and thank you, Nora and CJ.
Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me okay?
Perfect.
Great. So, like Ms. Gonzalez-Murphy mentioned, we are, DCGS and OTD are the co-chairs of the Interagency Task Force. That task force addresses human trafficking issues statewide. And we also work with regional task forces across the state, nor mostly downstate and the upstate. When the trafficking statutes, civil and criminal, went into effect in 2007, only law enforcement agencies were authorized to make referrals. And there are at least two problems with that. Advocates were concerned that many victims were unlikely to divulge to law enforcement for a number of valid reasons, some mentioned earlier. And B, there's a lingering concern with advocates that confirmation process necessarily includes either OTDA or DCJ as contacting law enforcement. That's totally false. The communications between OTDA and DCJS are limited to those agencies only and the referral source, whoever makes the referral. So, and I constantly get inquiries even now about our contacting law enforcement. We do not. And that only happens when the referral source has worked in conjunction with law enforcement, that we talk to law enforcement. The change in 2016 that authorized social and legal services agencies to make the referrals brought about basically a tripling of our highest number of referrals that we ever received. So once we got away from law enforcement only, to allowing established legal and social service providers to make these referrals, then our numbers tripled and pretty much remained steady since that time. So this confirmation process, it's fairly simple, and we now have, it used to be only by fax, and this year we went from a fax procedure, which is still in place. So for some of you who don't have who haven't at least done the electronic procedure, we still have the fax system in place, but we're trying to get away from that. So we strongly urge you to take advantage of the new electronic referral process now. It's on OTDA's website and ours also. And additionally, if you Google the referral, it'll come up and you'll be able to log into the referral from that site also. So basically, the process doesn't require too much. As you see on the form, it's pretty generic information we request. And so there are two things we look for. One, if the trafficking occurred in New York State, and that's not a too difficult point to meet. For example, if the trafficking occurred in Maryland, but the victim found herself threatened by the trafficker while in New York State, if there's a phone call or reaching out to the victim's family or someone on behalf of the trafficker to somehow connect with the victim, then that would be considered trafficking in New York State. The other thing we look for is the time period. We seek to address cases that have been where a victim's been trafficked since November of 2007. But once again, that's not a hard and fast rule. If the person was victimized in 2000, but in 2008, the trafficker somehow reached out to the victim or warned the victim via family members or social contacts, or somehow made some type of contact with the victim or attempted to make a contact with the victim, then that could be construed as within the time period also. So, and when it comes to actually filling out the form itself, we don't require much. It can say something as simple as trafficker met victim at a cafe. The victim thought she was in a relationship with him. They moved in together. Subsequently, he began to force her into commercial sex. If she didn't provide, then he would hit her. Something as simple as that. I know it may appear to be a somewhat simplistic form, but we do have people who say, hey, we're not sure what to put in. It's unclear to us, but we try to convince all advocates to have the view that we'd much rather have DCJS and OTBA decline us as opposed to us deciding not to submit. So our perspective is submit first and ask questions later. So basically, we try to get you to work with us. We interpret the statute as broadly as it was drafted. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nora. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, CJ, for giving that introduction to the referral process. While you were talking, I put the OTDA website into the chat box for those of you who may be interested in accessing the new electronic referral form. I think especially for those of us who are working from home or from places outside of our office, this electronic referral form has been really helpful in helping us continue our work. And we actually, in terms of our statistics, had 2020 was our, we received the most referrals that we've ever received in the history of this program. So, please continue to use the electronic referral form. We are still accepting faxed referrals, but we are hoping to phase out that outdated technology at some point in 2021. One other clarification point, because I understand that there are folks who are here on this call who are from outside of New York State. Often we're asked if we accept referrals from outside New York State. We do if the trafficking has a link to New York. So if the person was recruited from New York or if they were trafficked to New York, we will accept and confirm referrals from those individuals. And as CJ mentioned, the main benefit of this confirmation process is to direct the victim to the appropriate provider network. For those of the victims that we confirm who are not documented, this is important because the confirmation process opens the door to the OTDA Response to Human Trafficking program. This Response to Human Trafficking program provides state-funded services to all victims of human trafficking, whether they be adult or children, labor trafficked or sex trafficked, and documented or undocumented. We also will provide for those individuals who are qualified for services through their local social service district a letter to get them into services at their local social service district. And once a person is confirmed, they can move on to some of the federal processes, whether that be a T visa or certification. And appearing on the screen now is actually the letter that you will receive from OTDA, which is the official notification of confirmation as a trafficking victim. And in addition to this accessing of benefits, some of the other benefits that this confirmation letter can assist with is assistance with vacatur, which is removal of criminal histories for certain qualified crimes. And for those who have who lack access to identity documents, for those who traffickers often will seize identity documents of victims in an effort to control them. This can offer a new proof of identity that the person has their name with a New York State letterhead on it. It can be extremely helpful to help advocate for some of those identity document restorations. And also it provides the victim with a statement from a state agency that indicates that their story has been believed. One of the most degrading things that happens to trafficking victims as part of their trafficking is often that a trafficker will tell them that no one will believe them, or if they've engaged in sex work, that they are a criminal, and the trafficker uses that as a method of control. So in that sense, having this as a statement that they've been believed by an authority can be really helpful in moving a person from victim to survivor. So again, if there's any questions regarding the New York State referral process, we encourage you to contact either myself or CJ, or you can write to the general inbox in the website that I have placed in the chat box. And we certainly hope that you will take advantage of this kind of unique to New York referral process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nora and CJ, for sharing with us about the work of the task force to support survivors in New York State. And thank you for sharing about the New York State Human Trafficking Referral Form, which we hope will be helpful for our audience who has joined us today. If you suspect that there is a human trafficking situation going on, you can make more than one referral. For emergencies, call 911. There's also the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is operated by Polaris. We've shared these numbers with you today. And in New York State, you can also call the ONA New Americans Hotline at 1-800-566-7636 for immigration services and referrals. You can also call the New Americans Hotline to access the Polaris hotline for human trafficking, or any of the numbers that we share today. You can call the New Americans Hotline to ask for that number. And you can also call the New Americans Hotline in New York State to connect with local disability services and resources in your community. If you suspect abuse or neglect and you're not sure if it's human trafficking or not, call and make a report. In New York State, we have the Justice Center for the Protection of People with Special Needs. Their hotline is also called the Vulnerable Person Central Register. So if you suspect abuse or neglect of an individual with a developmental disability, call this number. If you suspect a human trafficking situation of an individual with a developmental disability, you could call the National Human Trafficking Hotline and the Justice Center's hotline to report it. We've also shared the New York State Child Abuse Hotline to report abuse or neglect, and the New York State Domestic Violence Hotline can help connect individuals experiencing domestic violence with support. In New York State, we also have an innovative free program for victims of domestic violence, sexual offenses, stalking, and human trafficking. The Address Confidentiality Program, or ACP, shields and protects a victim's address, where they live. Individuals who participate in this program are assigned a substitute mailing address that hides their actual living address, which can be so vital if someone is a victim of trafficking or stalking or domestic violence. The Address Confidentiality Program is a 4-year program, and participants have the option to renew every 4 years. This New York State program is accessible to individuals with any immigration status, including undocumented individuals. And eligible individuals can submit an application by mail or fax or apply online. And we have shared this link with you today in the handout. As you may know, there is immigration support for new American survivors. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act created the T visa for survivors of trafficking. The U visa is for survivors of crimes. VAWA is for survivors of intimate partner violence. And the Special Immigrant Juvenile visa is for youth who cannot reunite with their parents due to abuse, neglect, or abandonment. And for referrals for an immigration attorney or to learn more about this, you can also call the New Americans Hotline. Now we're going to hear from Sarah Magana, Community Outreach and Training and Support Service Program Director of Domestic Violence Services at the Unity House of Troy, which is in the Capital Region of New York State. Sarah is a trauma-informed and survivor-centered provider, and since she will be sharing a case example, I just want to share a reminder of the content warning that we have for today, as these details can be distressing. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm glad Cynthia shared the trigger warning again. I'm going to share some pictures of a case study, and it can be triggering and a little disturbing for those who aren't involved in the direct service day to day seeing these things. It's hard, or really for anybody. So I encourage you all to utilize any resources, or look away if you have to. You don't have to look at it to get the information. So my name is Sarah Magana. I work at Unity House Domestic Violence Services. At the Domestic Violence Program, we do also serve victims of human trafficking. We work with Nora and CJ, my co-presenters, to do that. So I'm so excited to be here. I could go on and on about all the services we can provide to trafficking victims, but I really wanted to focus on the services we provide to victims with disabilities for this presentation. And the case study in particular I'm going to talk about is a victim with different developmental disabilities. So without further ado, I will share my PowerPoint, hopefully. Where is it? Am I sharing it? Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Oh, you can see a case study?
Yes.
Fantastic. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to use the name Ann Doe, but all the other demographics are correct and accurate. So we just wanted to protect the victim's confidentiality a bit. So Ann Doe was a female, aged 21. She was brought to us in May of 2019. At Unity House, at the Domestic Violence Program, we have we call it a DART. We really like acronyms. So A DART is a Disability Assault Response Team. And what this collaboration does is it serves victims of domestic violence and sexual assault with disabilities who are at an increased risk for lethality. I can infer based off research I've done and my knowledge of lethality that being a victim with a disability puts you at a heightened risk for lethality automatically. Unfortunately, because of funding and other things, there is not a lot of research surrounding victims with disabilities and what their risk of lethality is. And that always goes back to funding. So if you're ever trying to find research for something and it's not out there, it's because there's not funding for somebody to find the research. So I can infer that based off the different things that I know about victims with disabilities, that they're at a higher rate for multiple sexual assaults. And there is usually, if there's a caregiver situation, there's right off the bat, there's an imbalance of power and control, but they're just in a more vulnerable place. So I can infer based off my knowledge that they would be at a higher risk for lethality. So this is Ann Doe, female, age 21. She was brought to us in May of 2019. The DART. So the DART is serving victims with disabilities who are at a higher risk for lethality. And that is made up of Troy Police Department, us, Unity House being the victim service provider. We also have a disability-centered organization, the Independent Living Center of Hudson Valley. And we have a sexual assault, our local sexual assault organization out of Samaritan Hospital. They have SANE nurses on staff, and so they provide that aspect of it. So the victim presented to the emergency room. The officers went to the emergency room to take the report. So they were called to the emergency room to take a report from her. When you see the pictures, you'll understand why, but she was horribly assaulted. Evidence technicians came and took photos, and then the case was referred back to the special victims detective. So the officers just went there, took a report, and she said she was okay. She was going to go home with mom. What had happened was, I don't want to put the photos up there for too long, but this is Ann Doe. So she was a victim of strangulation. There are a couple of things that we can take away and learn from this. That I think is really important. That's why I share this. I don't, in my opinion, as a provider, I would have liked to see this case go a very different way, but we're victim services and we let the victims decide how they want their cases to go and what's best for them and what's safest for them. This was a unique case in the way that she was strangled. She's a victim of strangulation. You'll see the petechial hemorrhaging all around her eyes. So she was a victim of a pretty horrific strangulation. And she has bruises under her eyes and there's all these broken blood vessels all over her eyes. So she was a victim of pretty horrific strangulation. It was her sister's boyfriend. She was at her sister's house. She was hanging out with her sister and her boyfriend, and she was strangled. The police suspected there was a sexual assault component to this. However, the victim never identified that. So this is how she presented to the hospital. So she presented to the hospital. There were photos taken. The police left, referred it to the special victims detective. And then this detective, the next day, as being part of our DART team, our collaboration, came to me and said, we really, we want to bring a victim service in to meet this victim and what's the best way to go about this? Because her mom, who was her guardian, was very hesitant to speak to the police. And the police were obviously concerned about victim safety. These are all pictures of the assault. The police were obviously very concerned about victim safety and wanted to ensure she was safe, but mom was hesitant to let victims speak to the police when they tried to call. So he brought us in as a victim service provider. We came up with a plan. We worked with mom and victim to go to someone who was a service provider for her, so a safe, really safe, neutral location with a service provider that she already trusted. And we went to meet with mom and victim, a victim advocate from Unity House, and the police went to this third service provider to meet with them in a safe way. And what we really tried to do was find out what the victim wanted. But again, that's really hard when guardianship is in place. So we tried to kind of separate mom and educate mom on what we can do and how we can help, and then talk to victim and educate victim on what we can do and how we can help. The victim was a little distrustful of us and hesitant to speak without her mom, but she ended up talking to us. We were able to provide one of our MSWs can do on-the-spot TBI assessments. So a really sad thing that I really feel like the system failed this victim a little bit is the night before when she presented to the hospital where she was a victim of a horrific strangulation. We know that victims of strangulation can have traumatic brain injuries, and so they should be assessed right in the moment for a brain injury. She was not assessed for a brain injury. I suspect that is maybe because she has developmental disabilities, but I'm not sure. We were able to bring an MSW to do that the next day. We were able to work with mom and victim to really come up with a good plan on how they wanted to go through with charges, but it took a lot of collaboration between partners. And I think that's it for the case. This is our collaborative response. We safety plan, we provided support, we discussed all the possible outcomes, we worked with the police for them to provide support and information, and let the victim decide what she wanted to do. The victim did not want to testify in the case. The evidence collected by the evidence technicians, so that picture, the things that were collected night of the incident, were good enough that the district attorney was able to go through with charges and offer a plea deal even without victim testimony. And the victim was able to make her own decisions regarding the case, and that led to more victim empowerment. I think that is all I have. Where do I stop sharing?
Thank you, Sarah, for sharing this case with us and for your support for this individual to respect their wishes. And I know you touched on the fact that they had a guardianship in place and that could complicate matters. And we do know that for some individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, that guardianship is something that works for some families based on the individual's needs and strengths. But we also share resources in our handout if families, individuals, providers want to explore alternatives to guardianship. We have information about supported decision-making, which is an alternative process to legal guardianship. And Sarah will be available for questions also at the end of the presentation if you have any questions for her. Thank you. I'm now going to share some cases of human trafficking involving individuals with disabilities and new Americans. I'm going to open up another poll for you to engage with, and we will go over the poll shortly. In this case, the U.S. versus Kosminski, this case occurred in 1988 in Michigan. So if you'll remember, this case predates the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. This case involved two men with intellectual disabilities who were trafficked for labor on a dairy farm. Both of the individuals were in their 60s. One victim previously worked on another farm when he was recruited, and the other victim had previously been institutionalized and was experiencing homelessness the time that he was recruited for labor trafficking on this farm run by the Kosminskis. The two individuals had little medical care. They worked on this dairy farm for about 13 to 16 years for 7 days a week and up to 17 hours a day. They were initially paid $15 a week, and then they were paid nothing. They were both isolated from the outside world, and they endured physical abuse as well as threats and verbal abuse. One of the individuals, the one who had previously been institutionalized as he was growing up, he was threatened with being re-institutionalized if he did not work. Finally, one of the herdsmen on the dairy farm called public officials and reported the situation, and the individuals were removed from the farm. And for new Americans with disabilities today, the fear of institutionalization is still real, as well as the threat of immigration consequences. This is another historic case of human trafficking, which also predates the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. This case, U.S. v. Paletti-Lemus, involved at least 55 deaf new Americans from Mexico who were trafficked for labor. These individuals were promised a better life in the U.S., but instead they were trafficked for labor and were made to sell trinkets in New York City streets and subways. Some of the victims worked up to 70 hours a week, and they were forced to turn over the proceeds they made. They were physically abused, restrained, and forced to live in overcrowded housing with very little food. The traffickers would call the relatives of the deaf new Americans back home in Mexico and tell their family how happy they were in the United States in New York City. And they would share pictures of the trafficking victims smiling, and they would share these pictures at deaf schools in Mexico to try and recruit more victims and say, you too can come to America and have a wonderful life and work in the United States. Finally, in July of that year, 4 of the deaf new Americans fled the house where they were kept before dawn, and they walked into a Queens police station. They brought the police back to where they were living, and the police saw the dozens of other trafficking victims living in these overcrowded homes. In this case, the victims did not all use a formal sign language like Mexican Sign Language or American Sign Language. Some used gestures that were unique to their homes and community. And in this case, fortunately, the law enforcement and FBI agents took time to communicate, offer interpreters to understand what was going on. And this just signifies the importance of effective communication. In New York State, we have different communities of deaf new Americans who are not always proficient in a formal sign language, and it can be challenging to learn American Sign Language if you haven't learned a formal sign language when you were growing up. But it is important that we offer effective communication, especially in situations when, let's say, someone who is a deaf new American is experiencing domestic violence, and let's say that the abuser is a hearing person who can communicate with the police, and the police only hear the abuser's side of the story or the trafficker's side of the story, for instance, and these situations do occur. This case is a case of trafficking and domestic servitude, the U.S. versus Callahan. This is a more recent case that happened in Ohio in 2015, not that long ago. A woman with an intellectual disability was trafficked. She was forced to be a domestic servant and held captive with her toddler for 2 years. Her benefits were stolen, food was restricted, they were violent towards her. They and very disturbing. They had made her abuse her daughter on camera to use that as collateral against her, and said, you know, if you ever go to the police, we'll show this video, you'll lose your child. They threatened the individual and her child with attacks from the pit bulls and their exotic pets. They had snakes. And the traffickers also injured this woman repeatedly to gain access to opioids. So she was repeatedly in the emergency room for these injuries and being prescribed opioids. And in her time in the emergency room, unfortunately, she was not identified as a trafficking victim. How she finally was able to leave this situation, the woman acted really brilliantly. She was in a store and she stole a candy bar in front of a police officer, which was her cry for help. And when the police officer engaged with her, she was removed from this situation. But really tragically, she did lose custody of her child, which is also an issue for a prevalent issue for individuals with disabilities and individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities having custody. This last case involved benefit theft again. This is a trend that we see in trafficking cases involving individuals with disabilities. Their benefits are also stolen from them. In this case, the trafficker was a conservator, which means a legal guardian of two married individuals with intellectual disabilities. So one of the individuals was forced to perform sexual acts in order for the trafficker to cover their living expenses, as he threatened. And they were also robbed of their benefits, which I wanted to share about that trend because new Americans can access benefits, including supplemental security income. We can share a resource that has a chart that kind of breaks it down, like which immigration statuses and situations can access different benefits. But I just wanted to share that because that is a trend that co-occurs with these trafficking situations and can also be seen as, you know, a magnet for traffickers to target some individuals with disabilities. So a warning sign that we see is when there is one representative payee. The representative payee is the person who's managing the benefits. But when one person is doing that for multiple unrelated adults, that can be a warning sign of human trafficking. Going over some of the risk factors that can make individuals with disabilities vulnerable to human trafficking. Unfortunately, reliance on others to meet some daily needs. If the person you're relying on is abusive, that can be a risk factor for some individuals. Also, some individuals with disabilities, if they're used to caregivers, you know, touching them and caring for them and being desensitized to touch, can potentially lead to victimization if they're not understanding which touches count as sexual abuse. And that relates to the lack of sex education. There's not always sex education for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And sex education is important to understand what consent is and the fact that you can say no to unwanted touching. And if someone never learns that they can say no, that can make them vulnerable to abuse. As Sarah mentioned earlier, unequal relationships with caregivers and support staff can lead to victimization. Also, physical and social isolation, which can happen for some individuals with disabilities when environments and society are not accessible. Individual with a disability could be socially isolated and not have a strong social support network, and then they could be vulnerable to being groomed by a trafficker who might shower them with attention and make them feel loved in order to gain control over them and recruit them. Physical isolation can also be a barrier to to having a social support network if different environments aren't accessible, or if someone has difficulty leaving their house because they don't have a wheelchair accessible vehicle or public transportation they can access. Bias and stigma are also unfortunately pervasive, and if we don't believe victims who disclose abuse, it can prevent them from getting any support at all, and as Sarah said, can reinforce what the trafficker or abuser tells them: no one will believe you. And sometimes, unfortunately, we have the idea of who can be a victim or who's the perfect victim that we can believe, but we need to listen to and believe victims and people who tell us that they've been abused. So now review the poll question, which was true or false. People being trafficked always want to escape. And I see that the majority of you put false, which is the correct answer. People being trafficked don't always want to escape because every trafficking case is unique. And that's why it's important for us to meet people where they are. For different reasons, some victims do not realize that they are being trafficked. It can take time to realize that you have been abused, and identifying as a victim or a survivor of abuse or trafficking really happens on a spectrum. And I do want to share that victim is not a bad word, but if you are engaging with someone who is a victim or survivor of abuse, it's just recommended not to call them, when you're referring to them, don't call them a victim or survivor, call them their name, their preferred pronouns, and let them identify and meet them where they are on that journey. When thinking of the question, why do victims stay in abusive situations, in trafficking situations? And the short answer is it's complicated. In terms of domestic violence, it can take victims of domestic violence an average of 7 times trying to leave the situation before they're finally able to leave for good. Leaving an abusive situation is incredibly dangerous. When abusers or traffickers feel that they are losing control, they will act in even more dangerous ways and escalate violence to regain control. And we do not have statistics to my knowledge, about how many attempts it takes for trafficking victims to leave the trafficker. But we do understand some of the barriers that they may face. Some may have no other options, especially if they are an undocumented individual, or for some individuals with disabilities, they might not have had accommodations in employment or in education. They may have dropped out of school as a result of that lack of accommodations. Not having other options. Laura mentioned earlier public charge policies, which makes new Americans fearful of accessing benefits and having the fear of being deported, whether or not that policy actually applies to them by their status. Another reason why victims might stay is if they have a lack of a support system, and if they are a trafficking victim, they might not have had a strong support system in the first place. Individuals who have experienced abuse in the past or in their childhood are even more likely to experience abuse again. And abuse can even seem normal, and the individual might not realize that what they're experiencing is abuse. Victims can also form relationships with their traffickers. We call this traumatic bonding, the strong bond that is really resistant to change. The trafficker might be the one person that they have in their life, as we mentioned, if they're very socially isolated. And thinking of the lack of a support system, maybe the trafficking victim did try to reach out for help to someone, and then the person that they told went back to the trafficker and reported them, and they experienced more abuse because of that. And now that trafficking is going to be even less likely to reach out for help again. And that's something that traffickers do. They work to control their victims and to isolate them physically and socially. For a lot of trafficking victims, their identity documents are confiscated. This can be a major barrier to accessing other alternatives. Fortunately, in New York State, Nora and CJ had described the confirmation letter, which can act as an identity document for trafficking survivors. And again, the barrier of the fear of immigration or legal consequences, not understanding alternative options or available support, especially if the trafficker has threatened the individual and will call ICE on you, or I'll have you arrested, I'll say you stole from me. That fear can really keep someone in this abusive situation. Now we'll discuss some of the warning signs of human trafficking before we go on to practice making referrals. For individuals with and without disabilities, these are some warning signs, and these are also in the handout for you to access, and we have a link for an even longer list of warning signs that you can review to learn more about human trafficking. If someone interferes with efforts to speak to the individual, if you're not allowed to speak to that individual alone, someone's always escorting them somewhere and won't let people come close to them, this could be a warning sign. But we also want to be mindful that, individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities might have a caregiver or support staff who is going with them places, or maybe waiting outside the door while they use the bathroom, and it's just because they're caring for them. But the difference is, a caregiver or support staff might prompt the individual with the intellectual developmental disability to communicate and engage with others, or maybe they're speaking on behalf of them to get information about services or any other conversation. But when the caregiver or person with someone is really controlling and won't let anyone talk to them, this is a warning sign. We mentioned in the trafficking cases involving individuals with disabilities that when someone is managing the benefits for different adults, this is also a warning sign. Benefit fraud is a major trend in trafficking cases of individuals with disabilities. In the case of Callahan, I mentioned earlier, she was frequently going to the emergency room for injuries for the traffickers to access drugs. So this is also a warning sign that when individuals are frequently admitted to the emergency room and they have excessive prescriptions for scheduled drugs, this is a warning sign. And if you see other abuse, the person has untreated injuries, these are warning signs, and you can connect with trafficking resources or the Justice Center for the protection of people with special needs. For sex trafficking, individuals who shared that sex trafficking wasn't what they wanted to do, they felt pressured into it, they're afraid to stop. These are warning signs of sex trafficking. Now, we don't know a lot about the very disturbing issue of child sex trafficking, but according to Polaris, they recommend that a warning sign for children of sex trafficking is a child who lives with or is supported by caregivers or maybe an unrelated adult with a substance abuse problem who is abusive in other ways. This is a warning sign, and you can call Polaris or the New York State Child Abuse Hotline. For labor trafficking, warning signs can be, and if an individual is living and working at the same place, dangerous, overcrowded conditions, their employer is verbally abusive to them, Individuals have been removed from labor trafficking situations by people who witnessed someone being verbally abused by their employer, including individuals with developmental disabilities, and people who've seen that and made that call have helped to remove individuals from those labor trafficking situations. Other warning signs could be if a potential employer collects fees for the opportunity to work, and they don't provide details about the employment opportunity. Maybe they're requiring the individual to move to another place. These are warning signs. And with that in mind, we're going to make some practice referrals using some of the helplines that we have shared. So we're going to show you on the slides potential human trafficking situations. They're not all human trafficking situations. So with the scenario presented to you, you can choose the most appropriate referral, and we will discuss why. But as I mentioned earlier, if you're seeing a potential trafficking situation of an individual with a developmental disability and they're also being abused, it's not, a wrong answer to call the Justice Center. So keep that in mind that you can make more referrals, more than one referral, but for this, choose the most appropriate referral. So in this first situation, an individual discloses this. They say, I'm starting a new job, and my new boss says I need to pay him $300 for job training. He told me that I have to move to another state with him to start my training next week, or he will find someone else. Out of the available options, select the most appropriate referral for this. And if you've had difficulty accessing the poll feature during our presentation, we welcome you to share your answer in the chat. We'll give you one more minute to complete the poll. All right. For this situation, and CJ and Sarah, if you want to jump in and add anything, welcome you to. We have red flags for this situation. This is a potential human trafficking situation, and providers in New York State, in this situation, this is an individual who's disclosing this to you. This is someone you are working with. This is a good opportunity to access the New York State Human Trafficking Referral Form. If you can also call Polaris for this, but this could be a great opportunity to use the referral form. Some of the warning signs in this case are there are red flags for fraud. It seems that the recruiter is lying about the situation. It's really suspicious that they have to move and they have to pay for the opportunity to work. And the employer is almost threatening the individual. If they don't comply with this situation, they will lose the opportunity. And in this situation, the individual appears to have been recruited for human trafficking. So even though, maybe they haven't moved, they haven't started being trafficked, they've been recruited, so they can be eligible for the New York State Human Trafficking Referral Form. And I think
I'm sorry, I'll just add that, remember, under the New York State statute, the language is, does the person reasonably appear to be trafficking? And so like Cynthia said earlier, the person's already made a commitment, and think about it. Well, whether the person reasonably appears to be a victim of human trafficking, number one. Number two, the law requires that I consult the person who's making the referral. And so what could come out of that discussion would be that the person moved and like Cynthia said, was already signed up with the guy. So maybe she was recruited from someplace to another. Now here she is in the middle of Manhattan. She doesn't know where she is, and she's got to move to another place to take this job. And her alternative is now she's left with nothing. So those are coercive tactics, and that's something that we would consider as someone who reasonably appears. So, like I said earlier, submit the referral and let us decide. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Okay. All right, we will go to another situation. You in this situation are Fatima. You are a service provider, and a man and a woman approach you, and you say, "Welcome, my name is Fatima. How can I help you today?" And the man says, "Hello, my name is Dan." And then he says, "Kim, can you say hello, please?" And Kim says, "Hello." So select the most appropriate referral for the situation. Do we think that this is potentially a human trafficking situation, refer them for services? Do we call the Justice Center, or do we call the New Americans Hotline? And you have 1 more minute to complete the poll. Okay, I see that some people engage with the poll. So for this situation, this situation as it was shown does not have warning signs for human trafficking. I would describe this as appropriate behavior. In this situation, Dan appears to be a caregiver, and he's prompting Kim to say hello. So he's not interfering with efforts to speak to her or overly speaking for her. He's actually encouraging her to engage with the service provider, who is Fatima in this scenario. And it's really important that when we're serving individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities, that we engage directly with them, that we're not just talking to their caregiver and acting like they're not there. We want to consider their thoughts and opinions and what they're looking for, what their goals are. In this situation, if you are a service provider, you could ask, are you interested in learning more about disability services in New York State? If you're engaging with New Americans, you can call the New Americans Hotline to get information about local disability services in your community. And the New Americans Hotline has information about, which New Americans with their different immigration statuses, which individuals can access these different disability programs and services. I'm going to open poll again. For our next situation. So you walk into a store and overhear an employer, who is person A, speaking to an individual with a disability, a developmental disability, who is person B, who seems to work there. And then you hear person A say, "You are lucky to even have this job. Make one more mistake and I will have you deported." And then the individual says, "I'm sorry." Please choose the most appropriate referral for this scenario. So this situation has red flags and is a potential human trafficking situation. I see that those of you in the chat selected the New York State Human Trafficking Referral Form or the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So for this situation, we want to call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. In this scenario, this is not an individual that you are engaged with. So it's really important that, if you see a potential human trafficking situation, do not approach the victim, which may be difficult if you're seeing someone and you feel for them, and I'm sure a lot of people here today are helpers and want to help, but we can actually endanger the person by approaching them. The trafficker might retaliate against that individual, or they might hide them, which will make it harder for them to be removed from the situation. For this scenario, the correct answer would be to call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, because since you're not working with this individual to refer them for the New York State Human Trafficking Referral Form, the National Human Trafficking Hotline would be the best option. Additionally, because you are seeing an individual with a developmental disability verbally abused, you can call the Justice Center for the Protection of People with Special Needs. That is also a correct answer. And warning signs in this are that the employer is verbally abusive, they threaten deportation, and the employer, apologies for that last one. Thank you. So at this time, I want to say great job, everyone, for participating in our poll. I'm going to open up a satisfaction survey for our training today. I welcome you to engage with. And we also have in our chat a link where you can share anonymous questions that we will share with our presenters now to answer. But you can also submit questions that you would like us to answer in the chat function itself. And we have some questions from registration as well that we will go over now. At this time, I'll ask Jenny, do you see any questions in the chat that I'd like to ask?
No questions yet.
Great, then I will share a question from registration and welcome you to submit any questions that come up. So one of the questions from registration was, the individual said, "I know trafficking is happening here in Ithaca, and I would like our staff to learn more." And I was wondering, CJ or Sarah, if you'd like to respond to that question.
Sure. Well, before I get to that, remember when it comes to victims, we don't address the victims at all. So all of our contact on a particular referral comes only between us and the referral source. So like Cynthia was saying earlier, if you're not representing the person, there would really be no connection between us and the victim. And regarding training, sure, myself, I'm sure Sarah also, we do trainings all the time and are more than happy. And we've been to Ithaca a number of times. Thanks.
Yeah, I would be happy to do trainings. I second everything CJ said, so. Yeah.
To share. So other questions that were submitted, how to speak to younger children about this distressing subject. And one response that I have to this is that to look into resources for body safety is training material for caregivers and parents to empower young children to learn about healthy boundaries and what their safety network is. If something ever happened, who would they tell that to? That's called body safety, and there are a lot of resources for that online. And CJ and Sarah, do you have any other recommendations for this question?
I do think, I just wanted to add that now more than ever, it's so important to speak to younger children and even like adolescents, like younger adolescents, about trafficking, particularly because of the remote schooling and a lot of children having access to like Chromebooks and laptops that they didn't have before and having access to the internet. We know that traffickers will find victims, younger victims, on the internet. So utilizing those resources, having those conversations with younger children is more important now more than ever, in my opinion.
And I know OCFS showed the video I Am Little Red, and it's focused on younger children. I don't know if it's accessible through the internet or not, but getting into schools has always been somewhat of a challenge from my experience. So I Am Little Red, I think, is the title of the video, and it's something that kids might be affected by.
Yeah, that's a great resource, and it is accessible through the internet. You can find that video and screen it, and I definitely think that's a great resource for younger children.
Thank you. Please submit any questions through the link. Another question that was submitted was, do you find that people with a mental disability, are they easier trafficked than people with physical disabilities or vice versa? And maybe I will direct this towards Sarah first, if you wanted to share about your experience, if you have any thoughts about that.
Absolutely. I do find that people with mental disabilities, including like mental health diagnoses, developmental disabilities, all those things are at a heightened risk for trafficking. I find that probably, I'm going to say just 100% of the trafficking victims I've served have had some sort of mental health diagnosis, and it's so hard for me to get to the root of if that diagnosis was pre-existing or it's a result of the trauma that was due to their trafficking. It's so hard for me to determine that because trauma represents itself in ways that look like a mental health diagnosis. It's really hard to get to that, and I know that a lot of trafficking victims I've served have complex PTSD as a result of their trafficking. However, someone having a pre-existing mental health condition is going to make them more vulnerable and put them at a heightened risk for trafficking.
Thank you, Sarah.
And it's very consistent with what traffickers are looking for someone who's vulnerable. And so even if they may not meet the actual medical definition of someone with a mental disability, even if the trafficker finds that some person is having some kind of issue at home or some other situation where they feel that the person, needs attention, that sort of thing, these predators are looking for things exactly like that. So it's probably more difficult to victimize someone who has a more simple or simply diagnosed or like a physical ailment, an issue with a body or a limb or something, who still have their mental facilities intact versus someone who's got some type of mental issue going on.
Thank you. The last question we'll share, maybe we've gone over some of this information, but I want to make sure that everyone has this going forward. Who to tell to get help? So Sarah and CJ, I'll share this with you. Who to tell to get help?
I do think all of the hotlines that have been provided can be useful in getting help. I also always advise soft handoffs with trafficking victims and all victims of violence. So if you can figure out who your local program is that serves trafficking victims and build a relationship with them, and then have a good rapport and collaboration where you can do soft handoffs if you have a trafficking victim, or even, if you are the local provider for trafficking victims, disseminating all of your literature outreach materials so victims know that they can call your program locally to get help. Because sometimes it's the national numbers are really great, but the national numbers they do the same thing. They'll direct you to who your local program is, to who you need to go to get help. That's what they do. So definitely building those relationships and knowing who locally is the provider and who can help.
Right, Sarah's exactly right, and of course we would advise to make those connections early, because you never know when you're going to come across something. And so a lot of these areas are covered by task forces. When something comes up, people can immediately make a referral and say, hey, we have a victim who is in Erie County. We need to get this victim from Erie County to Nassau County within the day. And by perhaps a task force, you may be able to put those take that. So and like Sarah said, the national hotlines like Polaris will put the victim in touch with the local emergency providers, and that's one thing. But having a service network in place already is a great thing.
Thank you so much. At this point, I want to end with a quote by Brene Brown, psychologist, who says, "Shame cannot survive being spoken. Shame cannot survive empathy." So if we think of empathy as the opposite of shame, and really shame and stigma are tools that traffickers and abusers use to silence their victims, to prevent them from reaching out, to make them feel ashamed of themselves when it is not their fault. It's no one's fault if they have been abused or trafficked. The fault lies with the trafficker. And we're really grateful that you have all joined us today. We know that talking and learning about trafficking and abuse is distressing, but these conversations can ultimately help us to combat the pervasive shame and stigma that can still exist in our society. I also really want to thank Sarah and Nora and CJ for joining us today. Before this webinar, I had the pleasure of seeing you all present at the University at Albany on a panel on trafficking in the Capital Region, and I learned so much. from that panel, and just really grateful to have you share today with the ONA Network. And for the folks joining us from out of state, we're so glad that you have joined us today, and we will share these materials with you, and we welcome you to connect with the Ramirez June Initiative. We have our New Americans email, and we welcome you to connect with us on the internet and social media. At this time, we will end the recording, and if you'd like to stay with us for a 5-minute meditation to help